I'd argue that the carers movement, in a way, began with Mary Webster, who collected around her a group of people equally outraged at the disadvantage they had faced, because as women in the 60s, having given up families, because that was a choice they had to make then, if they wanted a career, they consciously opted to have careers rather than marriages and families. They then found themselves as single daughters in families entirely responsible for the care of their ageing and unwell parents. And she described caring as being in prison. She was so cut off from the life that she'd built for herself. And this vision she had of helping people, absolutely cut off.
Throughout 1962, Mary Webster, along with a few like-minded women, wrote letters to influential people and politicians to highlight the plight of single women with dependents. In January 1963, May Abbott wrote an article, Single and Silent, in the Guardian newspaper, which brought Mary Webster and her campaign to a wider audience. It contained an invitation to interested and sympathetic people to get in touch with Mary Webster.
She had an extraordinary response. So it was rather like the 60s equivalent of trending on Twitter. She had a whole front garden filled with mailbags from people who felt the same.
Over the following months, a huge amount of publicity was generated. Mary Webster's passion and energy propelled the issue into the spotlight. The clarity of the message was impressive. The support that flooded in convinced her that a new organisation was necessary.
For her, it was a women's issue. She was a political creature, and she gathered around her people she felt could have influence, and she caught the ear of Baroness Sear in the House of Lords, and actually the Association for the Single Woman and Her Elderly Dependents, which is what Carers UK originally launched with an event in the House of Lords.
The new council encouraged the growth of local groups, and through them and with them made information available to be shared more widely. They undertook and stimulated research. This research provided valuable data for their very important work of campaigning and lobbying to improve the plight of single women with dependents.
You can't deal with an issue until it's recognised, so Mary Webster and those that supported her early on did the most important thing, which was to begin to talk about an issue that until then had been very much a personal, private issue, hidden away from public view. And what Mary did in writing to the newspapers and beginning to talk to MPs was touch, if you like, the nerve that was actually running through society in many ways, that there were many, many thousands of women in Mary's position. So it was incredibly important that she had the courage and commitment not only to raise the issue and to talk personally about her circumstances, but to work hard and with great integrity and with great intelligence to really persuade politicians of the era and others in positions of influence to get behind the issue.
After the death of Mary Webster in 1969, the National Council for the Single Woman and Her Dependents carried on with its work. In 1982, the Council changed its name to the National Council for Carers and Their Elderly Dependents. Jill Pitt-Keithley became head of the council in 1985 and began to modernise and breathe new life into the organisation. Judith Oliver was a wife, mother and social worker. In 1981, she set up a new organisation, the Association of Carers.
I'd never heard of the existence of the organisation called the National Council for the Single Woman and Her Dependents. When I did hear about them, it was largely through people who were coming to the Association of Carers saying, as far as I know, this is the only organisation for carers, but it's only for single, never married women looking after elderly parents. The idea for an association of carers was partly because I was a carer myself. My husband was severely disabled following an accident. I went first of all to the King's Fund and asked them if they would give me a very small grant, I think it was about £400, so that I could travel a little and talk to carers and ask them what they thought would help. And having got their opinions and their ideas, I realised that actually they had the answers themselves. They wanted to meet each other, to be able to inform each other, share experiences, and they wanted an opportunity to put their voice forward and say what they wanted and to lobby, as we would say now. It was obvious that we tapped into something. People knew there was a need. It wasn't a concept that we had to sell to people, persuade them of. So the Equal Opportunities Commission came and said, this is largely a women's issue and we would like to make a grant. So we got a grant which at that time was £9,000 a year, which in 1981 was a substantial amount. We were able with that to rent a small office, to employ me and another person and to actually begin to communicate with carers and to get small groups set up and so on. It started and it absolutely exploded. So once we'd started getting the members in, then we had to start properly servicing them, properly giving them advice and a newsletter and listening to them being upset on the phone and so on. The stories we were able to tell were so moving that people could relate to them. We were absolutely approachable about publicity, particularly anything which was in the words of carers themselves. It was very busy, but it was very exciting. We were talking to people with great decision-making abilities. I mean, how often can you go straight to the minister? And we could go to ministers. We could go to the top of county councils. This was the issue which people were talking about. Single women and married men and single men could claim invalid care allowance, but married women couldn't. The argument was from the government that a married woman had a husband to support her, and we said, well, how ridiculous in some cases. It's the husband who can't work because of disability whom she's supporting. But the other thing was, of course, it was totally against any sort of equality. So we asked our members if anybody would be prepared to put themselves up as a test case. And Jackie Drake came forward. She was a married woman who had given up work in order to care for her frail elderly mother, and who, had she been a man in the same situation or a single woman in the same situation, would have got the benefit. So there was no confusion or muddied waters or anything.
The European Court ruled in favour of Jackie Drake. Government policy was held to be unlawful sexual discrimination, and in June 1986 the UK government extended invalid care allowance to married women.
I personally feel that the publicity, the strength that Jackie gave to that, the determination, with the backing of the Association of Carers, really brought the carers' plight to society's knowledge. That then laid the foundations for any other bills that come afterwards, and it meant that the government would really have to take notice of carers.
Some of the other achievements that we had in the early days one was identifying young carers. That was in 82, 83. And we did then get some very influential support from people. In Parliament, Jack Ashley, for example, was phenomenally helpful on that. My anger about the young carers situation is that I don't feel it's changed.
In 1987, I was then, as I was an employee, was informed of the possibility of, a great possibility really, of a merger between the Association of Carers and the National Council for Carers and their Elderly Dependents.
It was quite clear to see that if we didn't organise a merger ourselves, the Department of Health, which was funding both organisations, would have forced us into it. So it was far better that we were in the driving seat and bring about the merger ourselves.
The real importance was that whatever organisation was created by the merger, that it remained membership-led. I think they did very well with the name, changing it to Carers National Association. They took part of the Association of Carers, and they took part of the National Council for Carers and the Elderly Dependents, and came with Carers National Association, but very cleverly putting carers first, because that is what the organisation was for.
With Joe Pitt-Keithley at its head, the newly created Carers National Association emerged with new energy and resources to campaign on behalf of carers.
Within 3 years, we had 40 staff because we were able to bring in lots more money. We were able to expand a bit to other areas outside London, into Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. We had a relentless media campaign. They used to call me the media martini girl, anytime, any place, anywhere, because we would always go and do any media interview that was offered to us. And most importantly, we would always get a carer to speak in those interviews. One of the other things that we did was keep up political pressure. And so we would go to all party groups, we would endlessly speak at those, we would cultivate MPs. And any piece of legislation, and there were quite a few pieces of disability legislation at that time, we would brief about and bring again the plight of carers to the attention of MPs, both in Westminster and in their constituencies. And then we began to think that what we really needed was a piece of legislation which was aimed at carers themselves, not tacked on to a piece of community care or disability legislation. The first piece of legislation we had a bit of luck with was the first Carers Act. And we had a member of Parliament This was a Tory administration at the time. We had a Labour Member of Parliament, Malcolm Wicks, who'd done quite a bit of research and work about carers. And one of the very important things he'd done was to do numbers on carers and how much they were saving the nation. And that was also a very important piece of information which we put out relentlessly on the media. He came 10th in the private members' ballot in, I would have said, probably 1994. And we really focused on him to get him to take a piece of carers legislation. We had this meeting at the Department of Health and could scarcely believe that it seemed that the officials and the ministers were going to support the legislation. Now, of course, there was a price. They were not going to support the complete piece of legislation. They would support the carer's right to an assessment only. We decided it was best to go for what we could get something on the statute book and build on that. That was the first time carers themselves were recognised in legislation, not as an adjunct to people with disabilities or as a part of community care, but their own piece of legislation, first in the United Kingdom, first in the world.
Carers and work was one of the crucial issues in carers campaigns during the 1990s and continues to be a vital issue today. In 2008, carers won protection against discrimination and harassment at work. Sharon Coleman, who had a disabled son, claimed she experienced harassment by her employer and denial of flexible working arrangements offered to her colleagues. She took her case to the European Court and won.
So it's a very different landscape than Mary Webster was facing 50 years ago, but that's not to say that carers are still not facing a huge amount of challenges and difficulties in their caring experience. The way in which the health and care system work in England is that they are two different systems. But of course, as people, we have needs for support that run across both, whether that's need for health support from the GP or hospital treatment or monitoring of a long-term condition, or whether we need support into the home from a home care worker or help with washing or eating, for example. So our needs are whole, and yet the system are two different systems. At the moment, it is often the carers who are having to do all that integration between services. They are often the only person who knows the whole story, and they're having to coordinate between health and the benefits system and social care system, and that can be exhausting on top of everything else they have to do. So we need to find ways in which, at that ground level, if you like, carers are helped to coordinate things so it's not all falling on them, as well as that systems change as well. It's an issue that has got huge political salience at the moment, and all the parties are looking at this and trying to make it work. And I think we will see progress, but I think it feels very slow if you're trying to battle with things at the moment in terms of trying to get the right support for the person that you're looking after. The Care Act in England gives us a good legal framework and a good set of principles and a vision for what good care looks like. So that is a hugely important start. You have to have the legislation, but it's not sufficient on its own. It takes political will, there's no doubt about it. And for many, many years, governments of all political persuasions have really ducked the issue about proper investment in social care.
For individual carers, as they come into the caring situation, or until they discover Carers UK or organisations that can help them, the situation is still as dreadful, or in spite of how far we've come. What has changed is recognition of the carers movement itself and recognition of this as a political issue. We have turned a private trouble into a public issue.
It is a necessity. Pension equals nowhere.
In the end, the size of the community will drive the problem. We're talking 6 million people who are carers. That means 6 million people at least who are cared for. That is at least 12 million people, and the number is probably growing. They have a lot of political clout. And the worse things get and the louder they shout, the more chance you've got of developing policies which are really going to meet their needs.
The history of the carers movement over the last 50 years has been that it has taken on the most difficult challenges and made incredible headway. And I think we can really draw on the history and the resilience and courage of people who've gone before us in the sort of battles that we have now to secure better resources.